Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this glorious day. Thank you for enabling us to be here, enjoy the fellowship of others, and learn more about what's going on in the world, and fill us with information that we may never have heard about from our speaker today. Ask that you be with all those in our midst that are in need of your healing touch and grace in whatever means that may be. Just be with us and all of our fellow citizens. Amen. And with that, Wayne, would you kick it off? Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Dave Goodell. Happy birthday to you. Okay, Dave, come on up and give us your life story. I know, introduce the speaker.
Okay. Well, before I introduce the speaker, let me give you a little anecdote about next week and the waters. It's so important for people to have clean water. Many times they have the water there and it's the only thing they can drink, and if they drink it, they get all sorts of intestinal issues. So this is an amazing program. I will be running the 5K. So if I live, if I will set up a Tuesday, I think the name of the team I'm setting up is Thankful Tuesday Men and Women.
There you go.
And if you want to join, add 25 cents or whatever, I will probably live. But anyway, it's going to be fun. It's a great cause. Some people here have done great things for drilling wells and things like that. So John's going to talk about the program, and that'll be next week. So please come for that. It'll be very informative. Now, our anonymous agent, I'm sorry, you're all going to have to turn your chairs around and close your eyes. And, maybe not. No, we have David Harrison here to talk about all of our crimes that we've committed.
So good.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, Dave.
Aloha. Pleasure to be here. Part of the group normally. The nation of Israel has 3 spying agencies. One is externally oriented, that is Mossad. The second one is internally oriented, that's Shin Bet. And the third one, I don't know, except I suspect it's the IDF spying agency, the Israeli Defense Forces. The United States, on the other hand, has 22 spying, espionage, and intelligence gathering agencies.
Wow.
It's a rather large number.
Wow.
People question whether we need that many agencies. Obviously, it's a challenge to share information and to get people to respond to different threats or indications. One thing I wanted to do was clarify in the announcement in the bulletin, it said anonymous agent. That's not the correct terminology for a U.S. case officer in the CIA. An anonymous agent would most likely be a Russian or a Chinese spy who had decided to work with the U.S. CIA or FBI and so on like that. By the way, I'm not a retired scoop. I've never been in other than the Marine Corps in service. Also, I basically I've never served as an extra on the movie set of a James Bond movie. This is basically kind of like a bucket list thing where I wanted to, I got interested in it through three different events. One was my wife and I took two of our granddaughters down to Washington, D.C., because I always wanted to go to the Spy Museum. And I think it used to be on the outskirts of DC, but now it's very close to the Air and Space Museum. Still hard to find, though. Took us a while to find it. But it's a very good place to go if you have grandchildren or children between the age of 10 and 20 or so. There's a lot of interactive games and so on. And they have an excellent bookshop there where I picked up some books. So that happened last June. And then in August, I went to a dinner in Wilmington where H.K. Melton, who was not a spy, but has had a lot of contacts in the different organizations. He was a speaker. And this is a wonderful book, a lot of photographs in color. He's probably the largest private collector of spying tools and equipment, including from East Germany and Great Britain and the US and other places like that. So that was kind of kindled my interest to get into it. One of the things I want to do, and I'm not necessarily going to go in the order here. It's just I'm cherry picking things off this particular poster, and this one is really recommendations from a retired CIA agent in the sense of trying to create a new OSS, which was the Office of Strategic Services back in 1942 with Wild Bill Donovan, which morphed in 1947 into the CIA. Unfortunately, downsizing as far as the federal bureaucracy and government goes is kind of a contradiction in terms, but it would certainly probably make things much more efficient. So I'm going to read some definitions of terms off a glossary here. An agent, a person who spies on their own country, typically a citizen of a foreign country who is spying on behalf of the US, not to be confused with CIA employees. Asset, ASSET, a clandestine source or method, an agent. Case officer, a CIA officer responsible for clandestinely assessing, spotting, developing, recruiting, and handling non-US citizens who have access to foreign intelligence vital to the US foreign policy and national security decision makers. Classified, information that the US government deems would be harmful to national security if it were released to the public and therefore requires a certain level of protection. Obviously, we have a few senior statesmen or presidents who have mishandled or had classified information in places that were not safe or secure. Access to this information is restricted by law to people with the necessary security clearance and need to know. Compromised, when an asset or an operation is uncovered. Counterintelligence, information gathered and activities conducted to protect against the efforts of foreign intelligence agencies. A dead drop, a secret location where materials can be left, sometimes in a concealment device for someone else to then retrieve, often used between an intelligence officer and their asset or agent. Espionage, the use of clandestine efforts to acquire classified information, the unauthorized transmittal of classified information to a foreign nation or entities with the intent to harm the U.S. or aid a foreign power. Exfiltration, a clandestine operation to bring a defector or asset out of their country to avoid harm or capture. Handler, the case officer who manages an agent. Honey trap, spy slang for using men or women to seduce or entrapment others for the purpose of intelligence gathering, a tactic often practiced by the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Humint, H-U-M-I-N-T, intelligence collected from human sources. It's the oldest method for collecting information, and until the technical revolution of the mid to late 20th century, it was the primary source of intelligence. Intelligence, valuable secret information gathered within or outside the US that involves threats to our nation, its people, its property, or interests. Development, proliferation, or use of weapons of mass destruction. Any other matter bearing on the US national or homeland security. Intelligence can also refer to analytical products such as the President's Daily Brief that are created from raw intelligence gathered and analyzed by intelligence officers. The intelligence community, a group of 22 or more US executive branches and military organizations. Many of the military services have their own intelligence networks, as well as the Department of Defense, NASA, CIA, FBI, and so on. And they work both separately, mostly separately, I guess, protecting their own turf lots of times, together to conduct activities necessary to collect secret information or covert actions to inform policymakers and protect the national security interests of the United States. I'm getting toward the end of the glossary. So. A mole, an agent of one organization or intelligence agency that penetrates another organization, an intelligence agency for purposes of gaining privilege or classified information. Sleeper, an agent or spy living as an ordinary citizen in a foreign country and acts only if and when directed by their home agency. And the last one is a walk-in, a potential asset who offers information to a foreign intelligence service by walking into that service's official installation. One thing I wanted to mention was that the process or the type of spying has evolved and changed a lot, as you may imagine, in the last several years. Originally, it was more a state or nation-sponsored type of thing, typically between the US and the Soviet Union. You had much more human intelligence. These days, of course, it's much more high-tech. As we're sitting here today, I'm sure we're being spied on in the atmosphere or other places at this particular time. The other thing is that after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the type of spying and espionage and terrorism evolved more toward these asymmetric non-nation state groups. We really didn't have much of a respite between the falling of the Berlin Wall. And these create a lot more serious challenges for our agency employees to track. There are four main motives for spying. Number one, revenge. Number two, ego. Number three, money. Number 4, ideology. Sometimes you can have a combination of all 4. And of course, we've had our own moles or spies within our ranks that it took a long time to really identify. The revenge, perception of unfair firing or lack of promotion. Sometimes, in the case of a Russian or 2, family members were either eliminated or promised jobs that were unfulfilled. There have been cases of revenge on both sides, US and Russia. Ego, individual believes he or she can outsmart the institution. Some spies are successful for a long period of time. Thirdly, money. A case officer wants to have a higher standard of living and eventually prove to be a tell if they're buying lots of expensive luxury types of items that are present to all to see through conspicuous consumption. And fourthly, ideology, communist or other systems, philosophies that do not live up to the expectations of the person. There are a lot of modern threats out there, as you can well imagine. We see them all the time, and a lot of them emanate out of China. And most of you are pretty well aware of all those problems, but one of them is biochemical warfare. We really don't, as far as I know, have a lot of public answers to what happened at the Wuhan lab, if it did originate there or other places. Cyber warfare is much more common now, both by nation actors, but also non-nation actors, just outsiders looking to try to bribe organizations or other things similar to that. As many of you are aware, there are a lot of drones and balloons flying around. They're not necessarily looking at the weather. As my own example, I ended up buying a small drone recently, and guess where that was manufactured? China. So we still have to do a lot of onshoring on manufacturing and so on like that. So the question becomes really, we don't have hundreds of thousands of troops stationed overseas, but you could make a case that there's kind of a silent, invisible, sometimes visible war going on. So don't take it for granted that everything's hunky-dory. And of course, recently, there's some more wars around the globe at this particular time, and certainly some protests and so on going here, which could be possibly sponsored by outside parties. A couple more things about China. As you may be aware, that over 20,000 male Chinese have crossed the southern border. Even if just 1% of those are working for CCP, that's still a couple hundred possible agents coming in. The Chinese are very loyal to the motherland or the fatherland, even if they reside in a different part of the world. And typically, many of the Chinese do not get paid cash. So unlike some of the other instances or cases, it's easier to track these offenders because you can track the financial trail of what they're doing. The Chinese, of course, have been stealing intellectual property for a long time and are, threatening a takeover of Taiwan again at some point. Most of my concentration in my reading I've probably read 6 or 8 books or so, has been from 1942 up to the current times. I haven't gone any further back in history. Um, I think I forgot to mention the third event that I did, and where I got some of these other books. There was a seminar out of Hillsdale College in Michigan. It was a 4-day seminar, October 1st and 4th of last year, 3 days before the attack, October 7th attack, which would have been very interesting to have heard from these former CIA, FBI, military case officers and others that spoke at this seminar. But that was kind of the third prong that got me really interested in spending more time on spying and espionage. Women have been a very understated part of the different U.S. organizations. They've been very critical. It was mostly kind of a male bastion until basically the late 80s, early 90s. A lot of the women were working out at Langley in the basement or in the lower levels. They weren't really getting a lot of recognition for a lot of the intelligence work they were doing. When their husbands were stationed overseas, they basically were not on the payroll of the CIA. They were kind of considered an extra luxury of having them do some minor details or menial type of details to help their husband serve his time overseas. Some of these books get into the fact that there were a couple, usually if you were a wife, you were not working with the agency at the same time, but later on, there's cases of where husband and wife had both been on the CIA or FBI payroll and so on. In this one case, it's Jana and Tony Mendez, and she spoke at this seminar at Hillsdale, and they were very active in Moscow. And the title of their book is Moscow Rules. And they were working with Hollywood at times, but they were making disguises for some of the CIA or FBI, CIA primarily employees who were being surveilled by the Russians in Moscow. And so they would disguise them, and then the car would leave the embassy perimeter, and then they would drop them off where they could pick up a dead drop or meet one of their spies, and so one of their agents in Russia and so on. So it's very interesting. I'm not sure it could be done as easily these days, but it was very interesting. And her husband died recently, but he worked for the CIA a long time, and she finished his book after he died. There's obviously Aldrich Ames, and there's Robert Hansen, two well-known spies, one with the CIA, one with the FBI. Took a long time to catch them. But there was also an American woman who was from Puerto Rico originally with her family, who ended up working for the Defense Department and was promoted, very bright, hardworking, promoted, and turned out to be a spy for Cuba. And that lasted, I think, for 15 or 20 years. And her brother and sister-in-law worked for the FBI. Her brother worked for the FBI, and she was the only real turncoat among the group. But it took a woman from, I think, one of the Defense Department organizations or departments to really discover her, what she was doing and so on. And the FBI for a while did not really believe her, that since she had all these good reports, performance reports and so on, that she was actually spying against the US. But it took a long time for them to catch her. She ended up in jail for roughly 10 years plus and was released January of 2023. Going back to the women, after the Berlin Wall fell and we didn't seem to have any major large nation types of challenges or threats, they had women down in the lower levels of Langley, and they were going through a bunch of different documents, cables that came in, and they started seeing some relationships between these cables. They started connecting some of the dots, and in the mid to late 90s, they started to see that there was this big network of contacts between different members of basically the Taliban or the other groups and Al Qaeda, and so they started to make these connections to this, and they tried to pass this information up to the hierarchy, to the higher ups, but they didn't really take it honestly as being important information. And so in a sense, this group of women that were working on this had kind of discovered that there was this a terrorist group out there that could potentially do harm to the US. And of course, after the fact, we had 9/11 and so on. They started to get a little bit of recognition, but not really what they deserved. The Moscow rules book with the Mendezes, they have all these rules on it. Again, they were a little bit like Q and James Bond, where they were coming up with these masks and disguises to free up the CIA officers who were very effective in Moscow and Russia for a long time until Aldrich Ames and Robert Hansen they noticed, like in the mid 80s, that a lot of their agents were disappearing. They weren't getting the information they were getting before. And so finally, the US side discovered, that maybe we had a mole, we had somebody inside who was giving away information. Some of the rules from the Moscow rules are: Murphy is right, never go against your gut, build in opportunity but use it sparingly, lull the enemy into a sense of complacency, use misdirection, illusion, and deception, execute surveillance detection run designed to draw them out over time. Once is an accident, twice is a coincidence, but 3 times is an enemy action. Technology will always let you down. Never fall in love with your agent. Betrayal can come from within, particularly with a couple of these moles from the US. The new OSS poster basically came from Chuck Gaddis, who served many years with the CIA. He was one of the speakers at Hillsdale. His wife was also in the CIA. He was a longtime case officer out in the boondocks and so on. A lot of people feel, several people feel that there's too much politicization and bureaucratization in CIA and other departments of spying and espionage. So part of his recommendation was you basically have to start over. You got to keep the organization much smaller. Right now, from what I Googled, there's about 21,500 employees in the CIA, 35,000 in the FBI. So a lot of paper shufflers there as well. Keep it flat so you don't have all these layers that you have to go through to get approval for different operations or actions. It's typical of a lot of large organizations. Select potential leaders and put in place an expert track for these individuals. Focus on the performance of individual skills. Institutionalize the training of leaders and managers and enforce standards of performance and behavior. Toughen training. Again, a lot of the upper echelons are not really field ready to serve at different overseas locations. Institutionalize standards of physical fitness and medical qualifications. Reduce the number of spying agencies. Use sparingly, and when you do, support it. Obviously, you have a lot of people that top layers who are more into the political, cover your CYA type thing. Write up these reports, anything that kind of stalls the ability to respond quickly. Demand results. I'm not sure what he means by diversify. Increase compensation and take care of your people. Keep it independent and try to reform it immediately. So there's obviously a lot of inward looking that needs to be done by our agencies. We've had lots of situations where they've uncovered threats early, which have been helpful, and other times where they miss it. As they say, I guess, in the business, you can be right 99 times, but if you're wrong one time, you may pay the price for that kind of thing. I think that's pretty much my presentation. If there are any questions or people have something else they want to ask, Ray?
What's the difference between the CIA and the FBI?
Well, the difference is supposed to be that the CIA focuses internationally and the FBI is domestic. And like 9/11, looking back, I guess it's kind of a crossover. And it appears that from what I've read a little bit, that the communication was not necessarily great between the two entities, and people tend to try to protect their own turf or blame the other organization, depending on how it goes. I guess we have a national security advisor, but I can't see how he can combine information, how they come up with the president's, part of the president's brief every day if you're getting information coming from 20 plus sources and trying to collate that and focus on what's important and not important on it. But there's certainly been stumbles among these organizations along the way. But reforms are going to be hard to get, I'm sure. Go ahead, please.
You told us about the woman from Puerto Rico who spied against the United States, got 10 years in prison, and then released. that it? Did they just release her?
It's a good question. This book was written before the release date. I think, obviously her resume is somewhat tainted now. She won't be able to get a government job for sure. I don't know. Maybe she can get a job on one of the college campuses. I don't know. It's hard to say. But she did not show any remorse at all on her spine. Her siblings had a real hard time trying to relate to her and really find out why she did this, particularly since they worked for the U.S. government and so on. Yes, please.
I'm pretty naive when it comes to this spying business, but what are the main things that spying takes place for? What do people spy about,
Well, they obviously, as you may be aware, the Chinese have bought a lot of property, farmland near some major military bases. So if they can get any information from employees that are inside these bases working here, they also, a lot of the college professors do advising or consulting for different organizations. There have been cases where they have turned out to be spies for foreign countries. National secrets, top secret information.
like what? What do you?
NATO plans, say maybe NATO plans, how this Cent Command works in Tampa, who the players are there. I don't know, you could speculate on a lot of things. I'll try to come back to that. Go ahead.
You had mentioned women in the spy game, and of course, the first name that comes to my mind from World War II is Mata Hari, who certainly was I can't remember what her home country was, maybe France, I'm thinking, but she spied for the Germans and eventually got caught and executed. And even during the Revolutionary War, the Continental Army had a very effective spy ring to,
Washington.
You know,
Mostly military officers.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Can you talk about what Julia Child was doing? I think we just found that out just a few years ago.
Yeah. All I knew was that she worked for the OSS in Asia. I think she was supposed to do was a secretary, quote unquote, but she was probably doing more than that. But other than any other particulars, I'm not really sure. All interesting stuff. Go ahead.
Social media, what does that part play in spying, do you think?
Great question. I don't have the answers. You can take photographs, you can make mistakes by, our granddaughter works for Raytheon in Tucson, and she had to delete or cease a lot of her contacts because she's involved in defense missile systems simulation. And so they're pretty careful if you're working for a defense employer or company, but it's great for organizing protesters and getting people out. And it's, I guess, subject to your imagination as far as what you can do with it. And of course you have TikTok, which is a controversial situation. Chinese are very good at getting lots of information on us, as well as our own government sometimes. There's too much, there was a big tail to 9/11, which was negative, which the government in some cases started spying on American citizens or doing different things. So there've been, examples of where there's been overreach by our own government sometimes. So maybe not on a major scale, hopefully, but there's no privacy or confidentiality basically anymore, pretty much. Sorry. Yes, David.
The Kennedy assassination has lots of theories behind who was responsible. The mob or Castro or LBJ or
Right.
the Teamsters or whatever. You can see the motives of all those alleged motives, but why would the CIA be mentioned as one of the possible conspirators? What was their motive in taking out Kennedy?
I don't have the answer, but Edward Lansdale was a CIA agent who was very active in the Philippines right after World War II. And he essentially, along with one or two Filipinos, I think the Secretary of Defense of the Philippines, saved that from takeover by the communists. And then Lansdale was moved over to Vietnam to try to rescue the American position in Vietnam. There seems to be a capacity many times where if someone is successful one time, they're probably going to be successful again and again. And it was a much more difficult situation in Vietnam because it was not an English-speaking nation. You didn't have some institutions that were democratic or capitalistic or so on. So he was there, but the reason I mention that is he was brought in by Kennedy at some point in time on the Bay of Pigs invasion to try to save that. But there's always conspiracy theories, if you want to call it, out there, and I obviously am not privy to any inside information on who did what on any of those things. I think sometimes it's just incompetence, and you try to do things halfway rather than either 100% or not do it at all, kind of thing. Dan?
Sometimes the director of CIA has been promoted from within to get to that position, and sometimes it's a political appointment. In your sense, which way has been the most effective during the years?
I would say the less politics involved, probably the better. Sometimes I guess you need to clean things up in there, but I think Stansfield Turner was the CIA director briefly under Jimmy Carter. And if you really need to clean things up, I think it's good to get an outsider who's very strong-willed. But when you go outside, I think you lose a lot of the loyalty and respect of the people that have worked at the agency for a long time and who have, quote, earned their way up the ladder and make decisions on a more reasonable or normal basis as opposed to doing something that's politically expedient. But it's hard to say because there's not a lot of information floating around. You have to do some digging or have your contacts within the organization before. Dave?
Yeah, I've always been amazed at how after 9/11 we could have a person, I think it was a woman in the US, who pinpointed the exact location
Yes.
of the Al-Qaeda leader.
Right.
That it just blows my mind. I mean, he was never outside. He wasn't parading about. He was staying hidden because he was deathly afraid of.
Well, they had a messenger, I guess a courier, because correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think he had a lot of technology there that could be traced. And they had a courier that they ID'd from one of their sources, and were then able to locate the compound in Pakistan where he was. But again, the women, there are a lot more women case officers now, and the women deserve a lot of credit for making those connections on these non-state actors. It's hard to say where we're going to go, but it seems like it's a full-time job just to try to keep up with everything that's going on out there right now.
I have a follow-up question too. My wife calls me a sleeper. Should I start being concerned?
Just start snoring, and she'll know that you're a real sleeper.
Okay.
I don't know.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Bob.
In relation to women in the television, I saw an interview with a woman who worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency, and she was on the autistic spectrum. And her talent was finding differences in photos from the satellites. She had a particular talent for detecting patterns and changes in patterns. And she was apparently extremely good at finding changes in satellite photos.
Steffi or Robbie, did you have a question?
I did. I'm curious if any of the research you've done had an opinion about whether creating the Department of Homeland Security made it better, worse, or neutral in terms of coordinating these 22 groups, or are they one of the 22, or any of the above?
That's a really good question. That deserves some research and maybe a book.
You can write that.
Yeah, when I have some extra time, I'd be glad to do that. Yeah, interesting question. But I really appreciate the turnout today. I hope I educated you a little bit or helped you understand it a little bit. And keep your eyes and ears open, because there's a lot of things going, and I don't want to necessarily end on a sour note, but there's a lot of things going on out there that aren't conventional anymore. And just because it appears that we're not engaged ourselves in a full-scale war doesn't mean that not a lot of new types of warfare going on right at this minute. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David. It's an interesting subject. Maybe the intro to spying that we've heard will pique the interest on some of you on delving more into it to understand what is the landscape of spying. Are there any things that we should be concerned about? Maybe yes, maybe no. I think being informed is one of the best things we can do for ourselves, to know what's and shape our own opinions of what's right and what's wrong. Because there's probably multiple views on what takes place and what information an overlaying government should know about what's going on within its borders and especially outside its borders. My simple take on the external spying, CIA, those that work outside our borders or for possible threats from outside our border, are there for our protection. How far that goes to infringe on what is perceived as rights is very individualistic. The intent is good. Sometimes we've seen in the past, it can go overboard to maybe not being so good. Usually, I think, I can't recite the situations, but when that has happened egregiously, those things have been aired and brought to a stop. But it's a thin line, at least in my opinion, and we can have as many opinions as there are folks in this room today on the subject. But the overall intent, I believe, rightly or wrongly, is there for our own protection. There's things that those that are protecting us need to know. And there's things that they may find out that are superfluous and are not needed. But hopefully there's safeguards in place and that we pay attention to our political lives, those that we put in those powers of oversight, and keep them informed. If you have concerns, by all means, communicate it to your elected officials at whatever level that may be. So that's my 2 cents for a penny.
Very good.